Welcome to the 36th California Small Farm Conference. My name is Guido Lois. I'm a communications and events manager with CAF, and I'm not the one speaking today. We have an amazing panel of speakers moderated by our most recent addition to the CAF's team, Catherine. But before I give her the word, I wanted to go over some logistics. First of all, this workshop is being recorded, so just so you know. And if you have any questions, we wanted you to fill them in the Q&A, like using the Q&A feature that you have at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it at the bottom of your screen, it must be under more, those three little dots. So you can go in there, and we're asking you to do this because it's easier for us and the moderator to go through them and like make sure we're answering every question. If you have any comments, they're always welcome. Please put them on the chat. So we're going to keep those two separated. Lastly, I wanted to thank our sponsors so much for helping us make this happen. And that is all I have to say. Catherine, please take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Van Dyke. I'm the Water Policy and Organizing Manager here at CAF. We're here today to talk about dry farming, and I'm joined by our panelist, Cole Mazariegos Anastasio from Brisa Ranch in Pescadero, Dr. Yvonne Sokolar from UC Berkeley, Dr. Steve Gleesman from Condor's Hope in Cuyama. Each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. Please, again, type any questions into the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to make sure we get them answered. We've got a lot of great information to share with you, so I'll turn it over to Cole to get us started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cole Mazariegos Anastasio. Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. I am one of the three farmers / owner-operators of Brisa Ranch. We are a diversified 30-acre organic farm in Pescadero, California, in the southern end of San Mateo County. We grow a very wide range of crops. It's about 40 different crops in total, most of which are not dry farmed. We do a lot of crops that obviously you wouldn't even want to try that with, things like lettuce, for example. But we do dry farming for a handful of crops, a number of select crops. Dry farm tomatoes is something that we have a lot of experience with, have been doing for quite a long time. And so I think today, I am hoping to share our experiences with dry farming tomatoes, more or less as sort of an overarching how-to of how we approach it, with the audience in mind, particularly of those who maybe haven't dry farmed tomatoes before and are interested in trying it out. Alternatively, those who have done it before but maybe haven't had the best luck, or just want to hear different perspectives and different tips. And so from our end, I'm not an expert by any means of dry farming. Our team is not either. We just have quite a few years of experience doing it, and want to share that more or less. So I'll sort of start at the beginning of how we approach dry farming. The dry farm tomatoes that we grow, we do a number of different varieties. So we dry farm our early grow tomatoes, and we use both early grow and new grow varieties. I recommend both. We also grow a wide range of some heirloom tomatoes as well, dry farmed. So we do things like Brandywine, persimmon, which is sort of a yellow variety as well. Cherokee purple, Cherokee chocolate. We found that all those different varieties work very well for dry farming. Some of the production you're going to see with those is going to look different than how it would look in a non-dry farming system. The advantages that we see in particular is that you end up getting better fruit that's more flavorful. And from our perspective, our farm, to give some context, is largely focused on wholesale markets. About 95% of all the produce we grow is going to directly to different businesses throughout Northern California. We do a small CSA program. That's only about 5% of our sales essentially are to that. So the majority of it's that wholesale market. And from our perspective, dry farming is a way that we can differentiate our tomatoes in that market from other farms. I think one thing that, especially as a farm that's in the wholesale market, and we work with a lot of larger buyers of larger grocery chains. We work with a number of different institutions that are good sizes as well. And I think from our perspective, our goal is how can we always differentiate our product. We're certified organic, but I think from our perspective, that's a pretty basic type of differentiation that is shared by a lot of other growers. And so it's really, how can you go beyond that? We're also certified by real organic project, we sort of differentiate some of our growing practices and also our labor practices as well. So that's one type of differentiation. Dry farming is sort of another level of differentiation for us, where there are certain buyers that see that we have dry farm tomatoes. That's something that's not easy to get from a lot of larger growers or larger organic growers. And so it's sort of a differentiation that we have in the marketplace that, from our perspective, has made it worthwhile. And some of our large buyers in particular for our dry farm tomatoes, go through very large quantities. They're doing, 100 cases a week, for example, of our early girls, for example. So that's the equivalent of about a ton, about 2,000 pounds, and per week. And from their perspective, they buy from us in these quantities because it's dry farmed, particularly because there's a differentiation in flavor. So walking through kind of step by step of how we approach the dry farming practice, our first step is really focused on what we do in the greenhouse. I know a lot of different farms will approach tomato starts differently. A lot of farms will grow starts in very small size starts and then plant them maybe every foot with the idea that they'll eventually thin the starts out later. That's not our approach. Our approach is that we want to have very large, robust starts. And so to get into specifics, we sow everything in 10, 20 flats per trays. So kind of a standard small flat that we're planting 200 starts per tray with on heat mats. We plant those usually around February 15th each year. So we just did ours last week. And we then step them up later on into 50 cell trays. For those that are familiar with 50 cell trays, they're very large cells. So you end up getting very large plants that end up being, by the time that they're ready to be planted out in the field in late April. Usually we're planting them around April 20th to April 25th in the field. You're getting plants that are already well over a foot tall. Very, very, very robust plants, very robust root systems. And from our perspective, that's an important component of dry farming is starting off with good starts. I think in my personal experience, when we started off with smaller starts that maybe were in smaller cell sizes, the plants were not as established at the time of planting. And so we found that to be particularly an issue with basically the plant kind of getting set enough in the ground with minimal waterings afterwards to really be well established and survive. So I would say, dry farming process, first thing is start with really good starts. If you don't have the ability to grow your own starts in your own greenhouse, if you're not a farm that does your own greenhouse work, I'd recommend reaching out to some nurseries. Nurseries can actually do larger starts for you, although I know that's not common. Other farms may be able to do the same. So I do strongly recommend that as an important first step. For us, it's made a pretty significant difference. Once you have your plants in the ground, and again, that target planting date in the field is going to be late April. So typically about April 20th is our target date. It may go back to April 25th, give or take, depending on each year. Our timing of that planting is very much dependent on weather and soil moisture. And so another component with dry farming that I will say is important is your general soil till, your general sort of water holding capacity of your soil, and a lot of your soil practices that have gotten to that point. Dry farming is more challenging to do in land that you don't feel really confident and comfortable with the quality of the soil, first and foremost. On top of that, we've also found that it works better on land that has previously been dry farmed or alternatively previously been planted with a crop that maybe is not as water intensive. I'll get into kind of how we rotate our crops with what we have before tomatoes in a little bit, but we have found that makes a difference. And I know some of Yvonne's research has indicated similar results as well that I'm sure Yvonne will get to in a little bit. And in terms of if you're starting off like a new farm in a new field that maybe you don't feel as comfortable with the quality of the soil, dry farming is something that you may have to work towards. It may not be something that you can just jump right into. That's my 2 cents. And I think sometimes if you dive into it without really being fully prepared in that context, it can backfire. So once we do have things planted, if we can time our first planting around a rain, where the rain essentially is our first irrigation set to get the plants well established, that's what we're aiming for to do. That often works in a lot of years. It doesn't always. Obviously, luck is a factor there. And fortunately for us, we do have an abundance of water that we can utilize for dry farming. So I know a lot of folks who dry farm, it's usually due to a lack of access to water. That's not our situation. Our situation is we have sufficient water. It's really more of from our perspective, how do you grow, you know, particularly delicious and sort of differentiated tomatoes. And so from our perspective, if we don't have a good time, rain that times well at the beginning, we will often do our first irrigation actually with an overhead set. Alternatively, you can also irrigate through drip irrigation. Uh, Usually what we recommend, again, this is what depending on assuming it's a year where there's no rainfall, but just say after that late April planting date. After that, like let's say we plant on April 20th to give an example, and assuming there's no rainfall after that at all, we would do a overhead irrigation set when we first plant them and to get them established. The overhead irrigation set helps more so than drip has been our experience, because you end up getting a deeper watering. So you end up having a lot more water sort of trapped at deeper depths, which is really what your goal is with dry farming, is to have a big enough root system where plants are reaching very deep down into the soil for access to water. And drip irrigation works for that as well, but our experience has been overhead irrigation to start with is usually a better mechanism for doing that. We then, depending on the year and depending on the particular variety of tomato, will often irrigate one additional time. And usually the second irrigation may be through drip irrigation, and that will often be spaced about 3.5 to 4.5 weeks after the first irrigation. And again, all of this is really based on feel. It's really based on, has it rained at all? Has there been much moisture? Has it been hot days? Has it been cloudy? And so I wish there was a more clear-cut way of just saying, like, this is when you irrigate, this is when you don't. But it's really based more off feel. Your goal with dry farming, though, when the plants are young, is to have the plants be having enough access to water where they're going to survive. And this is sort of a general rule with dry farming, but not necessarily a lot beyond that. And in doing so, we found that ends up that really in turn helps with the process of the plants being well established at the beginning. They have enough vegetative growth at the beginning to really become sizable plants. I think I found that if there's not enough water at the very beginning of the dry farming process, ideally through rainfall, but alternatively through that early irrigation, then at that point, you may end up having very, very small plants that just are not going to be really worth the time. And I think if for those who are interested in dry farming tomatoes without access to any water, which I know some folks are in that situation, it's definitely possible to do by all means. And we've done it, multiple years without any water whatsoever. It just really depends on you feeling like you have a certain timing of rainfall that basically can coincide with that early planting. That first irrigation, whether it's through rainfall or your own irrigation practices, is important in order to kind of get the plant set up well for success later on. Once the plants, though, become well established, and really, as I mentioned, after that first initial irrigation and maybe a second irrigation, we cut off water at that point. To give a bit of context as well, one thing we found important with dry farming is our goal is to have very robust root systems, and that also involves us spreading out our plants. So we plant everything at 4-foot spacing in a row, and we're planting at 80-inch spacing between rows. Which is pretty big compared to, I think, a lot of other growers for tomatoes. But we found that really helps the plants to be able to branch out enough. It helps reduce disease pressure, which can be stronger when you're doing dry farming. We've also found that also helps with just having very large root systems that can, grow very widely in all different directions and very deep. When we have dug up our plants that were dry farm tomatoes, the root systems are kind of remarkable of how deep they go and how wide they go. Whatever you see above ground, it's considerably bigger below ground in terms of root systems, which is really the goal with the dry farming practice. Again, that some of that depends on the conditions of your soil beforehand, on making sure that your soil has good till, on making sure it's productive soil. So that's not to say that you can just jump into expecting that your first year in a particular plot of land. One other thing, just to go back to what I mentioned earlier about rotations. As I mentioned earlier, it's often helpful to focus on putting your tomatoes in an area that you feel like is good soil, also soil that preferably has been dry farmed or alternatively farmed with sort of not minimal irrigation, but lesser irrigation than some crops. So we wouldn't necessarily want to plant our tomatoes on land that was irrigated a ton the year before. Obviously wouldn't want to put it somewhere where you had like strawberries, for example, where you had strawberries kind of beat up on land quite a bit. And on top of that, too, it's a lot of irrigation on that site. We do a very unique unique method that we found works very well for us. It's not something that you read in any textbook, which is we actually plant our tomatoes after our potatoes, which a lot of folks would tell you is not the way to approach it, because of shared disease issues and shared family. So from our perspective, blight is a threat within our area, but we found it's not a particularly significant threat in our area compared to some other issues that exist. We found that some phylums when the plants are young is a more significant issue within our region. And again, we're in Pescadero, Southern and San Mateo County. I would say a lot of other farms that are within our region tend to have similar issues, where blight is an issue with a bigger issue is some phylums when the plants are young. By planting potatoes the year beforehand, that essentially wipes out the symphyllum threat. Symphyllums don't really exist where potatoes were planted the year before for the most part. And in turn, we find that that by doing that, you essentially have ground that was minimally irrigated the year before with potatoes, because there's so much. Our potatoes we don't dry farm, but we do very minimal irrigation. And it's a lot easier to do minimal irrigation with potatoes than a lot of other crops. You can dry farm them as well, but we've just sort of found it, working within our system, it's minimally irrigated. And we found that in turn also helps with the productivity of the tomatoes later on. Yvonne's research, I'm sure we'll speak more about that. And we were lucky enough to have her do some research on our farm a number of years ago. That I think sort of supported a lot of that general trend that we've noticed. And from our perspective, the other thing I would really say it's important as sort of a, one more thing to add is sort of a how-to guide is doing some pruning on the plants, especially removing suckers, is very important, especially early on during the dry farming process. It's important to do with tomatoes, I think, across the board, but it's particularly pronounced in how important it is, I think, with dry farm tomatoes, because you're really trying to, again, get your plant to essentially focus on investing in its fruit through sexual reproduction via the seeds in its fruit, and in turn, not focusing on vegetative growth beyond sort of the initial growth it gets to get established. So in terms of what you can kind of expect from those things, our experience in our climate is unique to where we are, but our experience has been that with our early girls, along with our beefsteaks, we have really good production, very consistent production each week, typically from mid-July all the way through late October. So it's a very long window in terms of having good production during that period. I would say that the production definitely tends to taper off later in the season, during the month of October. But that said, we still have large volumes that we're able to do pretty consistently. That I would not say the productivity or yield is that significantly different than if we were doing them on a non-dry farm system. Beefsteaks are a little bit more challenging. I'd say early girls and new girls are definitely the two varieties. And there's some other sort of iterations of those varieties that are out there, but those are the two varieties that tend to really just perform best in a dry farming system. Some of the heirloom tomatoes as well tend to do really well. We found Cherokee Purple and Cherokee Chocolate are two other varieties that work great in the system. Those varieties tend to produce a lot very early in the year compared to other heirlooms. In our area, which for context is also a lot of a colder climate. So like for context, we can grow lettuce year round where we are. That's why our production starts so late compared to some other areas for tomatoes. But we get really good production with our Cherokee Purples and Cherokee Chocolates all the way from late July, again, going into, I'd say early October. A lot of the other heirlooms are later. They're usually mid-August going into kind of early November. So I would say, to back up, in terms of really thinking about what your goals are with the dry farming practices, you're focusing on differentiating what you have available through the dry farming, and then in turn utilizing the resources that you have available. If you do have water available, that's a great resource. If you don't, it's possible, but it's more challenging. It requires a little bit of luck, to be honest. And to just kind of do a bit of a recap, important things to note, very large and robust greenhouse starts in particular, early succession of watering at the time of planting, that really gets the plants well established and have the watering focused on deep depths. Wide spacing on your plants. So again, we do 4-foot in row spacing, 80-inch spacing between rows, which is very kind of, I'd say, abnormally wide spacing. And variety selection is also very important. Again, early girls, new girls. If you're getting into dry farming for the first time, I would say go with one of those in particular, because they're kind of the easy gateway tomato into all the different types of dry farm tomatoes. And once you have your plants well established, pruning is very important, and then harvest is also important too, where you need to be harvesting it consistently and thoroughly. To make sure that you're keeping production up, making sure that you're also preventing disease issues in the field as well. And one thing that just kind of speaks also towards the spacing thing I mentioned. Blight also obviously it is a disease threat. It's less of a threat in our area than I'd say a lot of other areas of California. This wide spacing helps with ventilation, for that reason, as does the pruning. But I would just say, really focusing on finding the spacing size needed for your area. We're in a very windy area, so ventilation is that helps us with ventilation a lot. For folks who are in valleys that maybe don't have the same degree of strong winds, you may have to be more careful about disease issues in particular. But that would be my kind of general approach to sort of sum it up. We'll get more in we're happy to accept questions later on about some of our any questions that may come up about this. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, our dry farming and beyond, our website is producerranch.com. You can also find our contact information on our website. We're also active on Instagram and Facebook at Producer Ranch. And I would just say, for folks who are interested in this, feel free to reach out to us. I would say if you're trying to get into the dry farming field of tomatoes, try it out piecemeal, make sure you're doing it on ground you feel comfortable with. Start with easier varieties like early grow and new grow. And feel free to reach out, like I said, with any questions.
Thanks, Cole. We've got one question here. You've
Mhm.
already chatted a little bit about blight and the different ways you think about that. Someone's asking, are you doing controls like foliar biologicals for blight?
No, we're not. We're not. So our focus, actually, it's a good question. It's one thing I kind of forgot to get into a little bit. We don't do any controls for blight. As I mentioned, blight is less of a concern in our area, and I don't want to speak to necessarily how somebody would control an area where blight is a larger challenge, particularly perhaps more inland, less coastal with maybe less wind. For us, we found that blight is not as big of a challenge to where we haven't had to address it in that way. What we have done to kind of back up a little bit, our general approach towards, I think, not just dry farming tomatoes, but just any crop is really focused on soil health in terms of how we make sure that plants have nutrients they need from the soil. So from our end, soil preparation involves, obviously cover cropping, composting. That's true for everything that we grow. Cover cropping everything once per year. Beyond that, we're also focusing on a little bit of added nutrition for our tomato plants at the time of planting. And actually, I'm glad you asked this question because I forgot to mention this. The only additional sort of fertilizers at all, quote unquote fertilizers we put is at the time of planting, we're going to put 2 organic materials. So in addition to doing composting that we do through our whole field, we do some more localized composting kind of within the area that we're planting. So we plant by creating furrows with our tractor and then planting in the furrows. And we'll actually go and spread a small amount of compost in the furrows beforehand. We'll also use bone meal, again, an OMRI listed organic bone meal as well, that we find is very important for crops that fruit. So in particular, bone meal we found really works especially well for tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, just to name a few. And for tomatoes, we found that that's worthwhile to do at the time of planting. So I'd say those 2 things are things that have found very important in terms of doing that. In turn, we found that the plants really haven't had many disease issues. The one significant issue that we've really had with pests over the years was Impetius violence, which a lot of farmers in Pescara have had issues with. Since we've changed our system where we're now having tomatoes after potatoes, though, we have not had any issues with those whatsoever. And blight, we've seen in small amounts, really at the end of the season. And usually with blight, the one thing I would say that we've had success with is just removing plants, basically, from the field, removing them, putting them in a trash bag, basically. But for us, it hasn't been a particularly strong issue or a strong issue at all for us. So I would say like creating the conditions to basically have the plant healthy enough to not have those issues is more important. And that includes everything from nutrition, the wide spacing that I mentioned, and so on.
Thanks, Cole. We will have more time to ask Cole questions at the end, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne.
Sounds great. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Cole. It's great to get the full management overview and hopefully can fill in a couple of those details. with some of the research that we did partly on Cole's farm. Let me know, is the screen share is up and working?
Yes.
Great. So I am a researcher at UC Berkeley, and I'm going to talk today a little bit more about management learnings from research that we did a couple summers ago on a bunch of different dry farm tomato fields on the Central Coast. And these were all small diversified farms who have been dry farming for a while. So let's see, to get things started here, I just want to thank everyone who was involved in this whole project. You can see Cole here was one of the farmers involved in the study. And also thanks to our funding sources. And I also, of course, want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Awaswas speaking Yupi tribe and Chochenyo speaking Ohlone people, whose unceded territory encompasses the field sites and the laboratories where all this work I'm about to tell you about took place. So briefly, just to get us started, I wanted to step back and make sure that we all have a working definition of what dry farming actually is. So for me, most broadly, dry farming is any kind of farming in an arid area where you use little to no irrigation. And I say little to no, I know Cole was talking about irrigation at the beginning of the season, and in my mind, that is sort of mimicking historical rain patterns here. So obviously climate change is shifting what is possible and what you might need to supplement. But, sort of in the ideal case, not using any irrigation inputs, but sometimes maybe adding a little bit in at the very beginning of the season. So one of the most famous examples of dry farming is Hopi dry farming, which happens in Northeast Arizona for the most part. And this is a picture of Hopi dry farm corn plants. And this is a really cool system, and it's actually kind of different from the one that we use in California. So you can see on this graph here, this red line is measuring temperature, and it's a pretty good indicator of the growing season. And so you can see in Northeast Arizona, as the growing season peaks, you also have these blue bars, which show precipitation peaking as well. So it really means that the peak vegetative growth is coinciding with when there's actually water around. So one way to dry farm is to actually have water falling on your plants when you need it. Of course, in California, we're kind of in the opposite situation. So you can see for us during our peak vegetative growth, that's when there's absolutely no water falling whatsoever. And so that means that we needed a different way to handle this. And in California, we really do that by capturing moisture from these winter rains in soils and holding it there so that plants can use it over the course of a long dry season. And they're just accessing water that's stored in the ground this whole time when they're not receiving any rain. So I titled this talk In Deep Water because we are figuratively in deep water. I think in California, we understand that water sources are dwindling and precipitation patterns are shifting and something needs to change. And I also call it in deep water because in this case, the answer in part lies literally in deep water. It lies in being able to hold water deep in soils that plants can access over the course of a dry summer. And like Cole was talking about, the way folks do that is by using a bunch of different diversified farm systems and techniques. I also want to say that this is hugely dependent on climate. So no matter how much you cover crop and rotate your crops and all of these great things, if you're in the Central Valley, you're probably not going to be able to grow a tomato plant without any irrigation water. But in these coastal areas, if you do build organic matter in your soil and also these microbial systems that help plants during water stress, you can actually, and also like Cole was saying, over time, you can't do it the first season you try, but you can build these systems that allow dry farming to function. And so in building this organic matter and these soil microbial communities, you're really building systems that allow you to store deep water in soil profiles. And I like this schematic here. I think it does a nice job of showing how, at the beginning of the season, a plant has sort of shallow roots and it's using what it can find at the surface, and it'll use up all that water at the surface and then start sending roots deeper and deeper because there's no water coming down from the top. So it's just going to chase that water down the soil profile. And let's see here, just want to make sure. Okay, I think that's good enough. Great. So this is obviously a super cool system with huge implications for agriculture in California. And it really hasn't been studied that much from a more sort of scientific perspective. There are some really cool extension publications out there, and I'd encourage you to check out the CASFIS website. They have some great sort of grower guides and how-to PDFs and things like that. But we were interested in sort of looking at this from more of a scientific research approach. And wanted to do it in a participatory way to really collaborate with farmers who we see as experts in these systems. So this whole project started with me just talking to as many dry farmers as I could find on the Central Coast. And in all of those conversations, I was looking for situations where farmers might not have time or tools to really get satisfying information for themselves, but we're still really interested in having that information, and it could information that could be applied to actual management situations and outcomes. So one thing that farmers mentioned pretty often was nutrient depths. This picture again here shows water access, and of course water also has important implications for nutrient access as well. Farmers have also been marketed fungal inoculants. In this case, we were thinking about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And these are basically fungal spores that you can sprinkle onto plants. And they're known to help relieve water stress in some crops, so it seemed very relevant in this case. And finally, now that we're able to sequence DNA pretty easily, we've been able to start looking into soil microbial communities, just to see what fungi are around on the farm more broadly. And I think farmers have been just curious to get that window into what's happening in their soils. So combining all this together, we had three main research questions. The first was which depths of nutrients and which nutrients are most influential in determining dry farm fruit yield and quality. And as Cole was mentioning, quality is especially important in this system because tomatoes or dry farm tomatoes are really differentiated because of that special quality that consumers are really looking for. The second question was if fungal inoculants are effective in these low water systems. And then thirdly, just more broadly speaking, how can farmers best support high functioning soil fungal communities to improve harvest outcomes? And this was all on 7 different fields that were in the Central Coast region here in California. So again, needed to pick sites where there actually are climates that allow for dry farming. And if folks have questions later, I can talk a little bit more about a broader suitability analysis of other areas in California that could potentially be suitable to give a try with dry farming as well. So these are photos of the 7 different fields that we were working on, and we took soil samples from all of these fields. And then, of course, also took harvest samples. This was weekly harvests at all of the farms for as long as they were producing tomatoes. And the harvest data that we took, so we were looking at marketable yields. We were looking at the percent of tomatoes that were impacted by blossom end rot, which is a common concern, mostly cosmetic concern, but if it gets severe enough, can actually really damage tomatoes. And last, we were looking at the fruit percent dry weight as a sort of proxy for fruit quality. And I think that just makes some intuitive sense. The higher the dry weight, the less the water there is in a tomato. And you can just imagine really watery tomatoes that are not the really yummy, flavorful, tasty ones. So higher dry weight means more flavorful and full of sugar, basically. Looking into the results here, the first thing that I just want to confirm with all of this is that we did find that surface soils dry down really quickly in these systems. So just to get us all oriented here, this is across time. So this would be, like Cole was saying, maybe around April was transplant, mid-season would be maybe June or July, and then harvest would start in August, September. So these are these 3 time points over the course of the season. And this pink line here shows surface soils, so the top foot of soil, basically. And you can see that they start out with a fair amount of plant available water, and then it drops pretty precipitously to mid-season, and there isn't even that much left to go towards harvest. So these surface soils are drying down quickly. The deeper soils, this is down to 3 or 4 feet in the soil profile. They start with more water and it gets used up more slowly. So there's still a fair amount of water being held here by the beginning of harvest. And that has important implications for nutrients. So we ran statistical models to really start to understand the relationships between nutrient depth and harvest outcomes. So the first thing we found is, I think often farmers in irrigated systems are really thinking about managing that top foot of topsoil. And in this case, the top 30 centimeters, so the top foot, actually had no impact on the harvest outcomes that we were seeing. Or nutrients in those top foot had no impact on the harvest outcomes that we were looking at. But if you get down sort of below like 1 to 2 feet, the nutrients there started to impact blossom and rot. And then down 60 to 100 centimeters, so down to like 3 or 4 feet, we started to see the nutrients way down there were associated with marketable yield and fruit quality. And this is a picture of me with my arm 60 centimeters down into a hole, just to give, I know metric systems are hard, but it's, like way, way, way down there that you have to get before nutrients have any association with harvest outcomes whatsoever. And the nutrients that were specifically impacting fruits were different forms of nitrogen. So ammonium and nitrate had sort of complicated relationships with yield and quality. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about exactly how that worked if there's questions about it later. In terms of inoculation, we found that there actually was not any correlation really between inoculation and fruit yield. And we actually found that fruit quality went down as plants were inoculated with AMF. So sort of general recommendation is that if you really want to try inoculants, of course, go for it. It's probably not going to be hugely detrimental, but would recommend trialing it on a small area. They are just expensive, and it seems perhaps not worth it in these dry farm systems, these AMF inoculants. And then finally, in terms of the broader fungal community, the way this graph here works is each of these dots is a soil sample, and they come from non-cultivated, so just, like a fence line or a fallow field nearby or something like that. Irrigated are the blue points, and pink are dry farm samples. So each point is a sample, and the closer they are together on the graph, the more similar the fungal communities were. So you can see in field 1A here, there's a sort of cluster of all of these non-cultivated samples being quite similar to each other. And then this cluster over here where the dry farm and irrigated soils, all those fungal communities were pretty similar to each other. But then you can compare that to this field 1B, where you can actually see this dry farm community is really starting to separate from the irrigated community here. And we thought that was really interesting and something that we wanted to sort of look more into what was going on there. And actually found this fungal taxa that is a signature of these dry farm soils. So as these communities started to separate out more, we found that Sardaromycetes were really enriched in dry farm soils compared to the counterpart irrigated soils. And not only that, but the longer farmers went without irrigating a field, the bigger that difference got. So that was exciting to see that it's sort of a signature that's building over time. And then even more interesting, we found that that signature actually then correlates with increased fruit quality. So if you don't if you don't irrigate for multiple years in a row, you get more of these Sardaromycetes. And then the more Sardaromycetes you have, the higher the fruit quality in the fruit that comes off of that field. And so again, in this really quality-centric system, this is sort of particularly important for farmers to be considering. Just to wrap up here, wanted to summarize with the 3 questions we were asking. So again, the first was which depths of nutrients and which nutrients were the most influential. And it turns out that nothing above 30 centimeters is influential at all. And most important are the ones below 60 centimeters, different forms of nitrogen. Fungal inoculants don't seem to be helpful or really matter very much. And then in terms of how farmers can best support high-functioning soil fungal communities to improve harvest outcomes, because there's this fungal signature that grows over time, exactly like Cole was saying, it could be helpful to practice dry farming the same field for multiple years in a row. And I think that also sort of gets to interesting questions of what other crops could be dry farmed in order to be able to actually think about having more of a sort of dry farm rotation on your fields. And then also, of course, that's interesting in terms of perennial systems, where, of course, once you plant a perennial crop, it's being dry farmed for as long as you're growing that perennial crop. And so I've gotten involved in a project with some dry farm wine growers, and Steve's going to be telling you a lot more about that next. So fun sort of transition into perennial systems. And I think I'll leave it here for now. You have my email address up here. I think someone might share it with you or put it in the chat later too. So this isn't your last chance. And Catherine, yeah, happy to take questions now or save them for the end, whatever's best.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'll let people type any questions in. We have a minute or two if there's anything for Yvonne. And seeing none, we'll move ahead to Steve. And again, feel free to put stuff into that Q&A section as questions come up so that we can answer them at the end. Without any further ado, handing it over to you, Steve.
All right, let me get the screen share set up.
That looks great. We can see your screen.
You set? Okay, good.
Yep, all set.
This is going to be a little different, to say the least, as we move from our annual crops to perennial crops in dry farming, and gives me a chance too to reflect back on how, over 40 years ago, I started in dry farming with dry farm tomatoes, just Santa Cruz County. And I know while we were doing those tomatoes, I always thought about perennial crops, and got the opportunity finally. In fact, Robbie Jaffe, my wife, and I were celebrating 25 years since we planted our dry farm 5 acres in the Cuyama Valley. So yeah, it's off and running. It's been quite an experience, but something very different than an annual. We're dealing with something whose roots probably go down meters into the ground, not just feet. And in fact, I've seen some reports of grape roots down over 100 feet. Of course, depending on the soil type, the climate, the varieties, everything else that we're looking at. But our little place in the Cuyama Valley is kind of an interesting region when you think about the fact that the Cuyama is one of the 21 most critically overdrafted groundwater basins in the entire state, and has been subject to SGMA, the Groundwater Management Act, and for the last 10 years has been struggling to develop a groundwater sustainability plan. And we've been very much involved in that, and it was all caused, of course, by agriculture that was completely dependent upon groundwater. There's no other source of water in the Cuyama. And, in this case, largely carrots. That data shows us just how much in the realm of several hundred feet of groundwater drop over the last 30 or 40 years, putting the valley into this condition of critically overdrafted. So a system like ours, where we don't use that much water, and in most years none at all, we really are talking about an alternative way to farm in places where this overdraft has become so critical. There's our 5 acres. We grow mostly wine grapes, but we also do olives for oil. And we started it, as I mentioned, we started the ranch 30 years ago, and our first major planting of grapes was 25 years ago. Now, it's interesting to think about what a dry farm climate is, and I disagree a tiny bit with Yvonne about what is dry farming. To me, there's dry farming and there's rain-fed farming, and there's sometimes combinations of the two. But my kind of dry farming that I think about is strictly related to the dry Mediterranean climate, like your graph showed so well, Yvonne, of all the rain in the winter, and in the case of our perennial crops when they're dormant, and no rain in the summer. And the only source of moisture for the crops is, as you said, the water that's stored in the soil. And in the Cuyama, with only our 7 to 15 inches of rainfall a year, and occurring only in that winter time, well, gosh, it's kind of a challenge to think about how you're going to maintain crop productivity in a summertime that is, completely rainless. And in the case of the Cuyama, the only source of water for irrigation in that summertime is groundwater. There's no surface water, no reservoirs, no pipelines. We really are facing, as Cole, you mentioned, the lack of water. We really depend on the winter rains, and really think about the history, the culture of managing the soil surface in order to keep the water in the soil. We do have a little backup drip system that we use mostly as supplemental water to get the grapes and olives established, but then never use it, only in extreme drought years, after which we've had a few of over the last 10 years, providing just enough water to keep the plants alive, because you really don't see much real stimulation and growth and all, but the plants do survive. And then when we do get rains like we did this past year, the plants bounce right back. And our particular 5-acre farm is part of a group of local farmers known as de minimis users. Our total use for all 5 acres, including our domestic use, is less than 2 acre-feet of water per year. And that's really very different from the carrot growers out there who use 3 to 4 acre-feet per acre per year. So it's a real different kind of a system. Now, we're also off the grid, and it's part of the reason our one small well, which delivers 4 or 5 acre-feet, 4 or 5 gallons per minute at the most, why we could store, but we really can't depend upon that as our source of irrigation. Now, even before I talk about the cover crop we use, maybe I should mention a little bit about establishing the grapes. And it's somewhat like Cole was talking about, a little bigger plant, getting those roots started, getting them down. Well, in a perennial like this, the first year, when you put a small grape transplant, be it a rooted cutting or a grafted bench graft, well, you need more moisture. You've got to give it a little bit to get it started. So we've learned over the years to water lightly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week in that first year. The second year, stretch the time out to about once a week and a little deeper watering, 3 or 4 gallons per plant. And then by the third year, depending on the range, we'll go to once a month and then water maybe 8 to 10 gallons when we do that one time only. And that way we're forcing the plants to keep going down after the water. And in those first few years, so that they don't keep roots up at the surface, they instead send those roots down. Same concept in getting the tomatoes to continue to grow after the water as it retreats from the surface. But our cover cropping in that winter time, and again, since we don't have excess irrigation, we have to wait for the first rain. And if the rains are late, our cover crop's late. We don't get as much growth. If it's early, we can plant and we'll get a lot more growth, but it'll vary from year to year. And we've experimented with, of course, several different kinds of cover crops, mixtures of grasses and legumes, and have found a few that really seem to work best for our particular area. And we use the classic head-trained, candelabra-shaped freestanding plant, pruned to 2 buds per spur on each arm. Sometimes we'll fork the arm and go twice if we have a wet spring, but then we'll cut back if we have a dry spring. And we've learned actually to design our plants for the worst year, which means in a perennial, we maybe will remove some of the arms you see on the head train thing and limit the number so that we don't produce a plant that demands more water than our particular system can provide. And we're planted on the classic sort of 3 meter or 10 by 10 meter spacing, sort of a spacing we've learned from other dry farm growers in the Central Coast region down near Paso Robles. And then when it comes time, when we think the rains have stopped, before the cover crop really starts to draw moisture from the soil, and what we feel is peak saturation of the soil horizon, we'll then mow and shred the cuttings and the cover crop, disc it in lightly with about a small disc behind our small tractor. And then we come back, and for us, what the real secret has been is the use of a soil conditioner that has the sweeps, spikes, and a little roller chopper on the back end that lifts the soil, spreads it out, and leaves a uniform layer about 3 inches deep of dry soil on top of the wet soil below. And in a sense, at the contact between that dry soil and the wet soil below, it's like pinching the straw. You've broken capillarity, the movement, the channels in the soil that allow water to move to the surface and evaporate. And evaporative stress, of course, at the surface would pull even more. But this old traditional practice of creating what we call a dust mulch, a mulch of the dry soil itself, it stops most of that evaporative loss, even into the summer. I can come out into the vineyard in the summertime, as you can see sort of in the background here, and say end of July, first part of August, and pull that dry soil aside, and there's still moisture right underneath it in the hot, dry summer of the Cuyama. We're certified organic. We're also real organic, as Cole mentioned, and have been since the beginning, and we really count on natural pest control. Our system of 5 acres is embedded in nature. We're surrounded by chaparral oak woodland. And so we have a lot of interplay back and forth. And the other thing that's been really good for our system out in the Cuyama with the very dry, low relative humidity in the summer, and then the open head train character of the vines we use, we've never had to put on any sulfur for bunch rot in 25 years. And that's a part of the farming practice, part of the climate, but I think it's another characteristic of the dry farm. This sort of goes the summer, give you the summer look with the dust mulch. The plants have grown. This is probably end of July, first part of August. We harvest a little bit earlier than a lot of the irrigated vineyards. Our Shiraz variety starts usually mid-August. The Zinfandel, another red grape, comes in first part of September, and in between the two, our white grape, Pedro Jimenez. So we're pretty much done harvesting by the end of September on our grapes. And just as the small fruit of the dry farm tomato concentrates the essence of what a tomato is supposed to be, we're seeing the same kind of thing in our grapes. They're smaller fruit size, thicker skinned. So when you crush, there's a lot more contact between the skin and the juice, and a lot more extraction of the skin flavors, which I think in our fruit forward varieties that we work with, it's an essential part of the dry farm character, and something that we also talk about as we promote our wine to the consumers that we deal with. Now, just this last summer, which was a wet summer, this is a little soil profile we opened, and it's kind of the beginning of a research project that we're trying to get some of the similar soil information that Yvonne's been able to gather on the tomatoes, but from these deep-rooted perennial dry farm systems. You can see at the top here the little 3-inch layer of dry soil sitting on the soil below, and starting at about, that 6-inch level. Even in the dry summer, we found moisture. And as we dug down, we only went down 2 feet in this case. There was available soil water at the beginning of August in the dry Cuyama summer, and sealed in and held in by that dry soil mulch that creates a barrier to evaporative loss. Now, the same thing is starting to show up. We have some initial nutrient analysis of the soil, and there's almost no available nitrogen in that upper 3 inches. But as soon as you get down into the moist soil below, the available nitrogen in the same forms that you were presenting at, Yvonne, it seems to be increasing as well. But then how much does that matter? You know, grapes and olives, you always kind of keep them on the hungry side, so they produce more fruit than vegetative growth. And their roots go so far down. I basically believe, due to the fact that we planted all of our plants in little gopher baskets originally 25 years ago, and gophers don't go down much more than about 18 inches. Our baskets go down to 24 and are open at the bottom. I think the gophers helped us prune those surface roots that would be subjected to more moisture loss and forced the plants to go even deeper. I've only dug down about 6 feet, and kind of accidentally, but found, you know, that the grape root itself was about the same diameter as the trunk at that depth and still going. So I have no idea how deep it goes. And again, I've seen some reports of them going very, very deep. Now, a piece too that I think we've mentioned, how important it is to let the consumer know how unique dry farm products are. And at the same time, we're planting on a 10 by 10 foot spacing, which is about a fraction of the density of a conventional industrial vineyard. So our yields per acre, of course, are going to be a lot less. In a good year, we're between 2 and 2.5 tons per acre on our grapes, which is a good yield for a dry farm system. But of course, in some drought years, those yields plummet. And so with a perennial crop, what we have learned to do and hope for, of course, is we get enough wet years to produce the extra inventory that gets us through the dry years. And we design our market to be able to adapt to that fluctuation in availability over time. We also bring community together. We have a wine club, friends, neighbors, family. We all gather for harvest parties in the vineyard itself. 30, 40, sometimes 50 people hang out for a weekend, wine, music, and a harvest. So it's part of kind of an old tradition in perennial crops, especially, of sharing the harvest in communities and helping each other during that time when there's a need for more hands. And we've become, of course, very, very much involved in the issues around water in our valley. And it just kind of not just farming to show there's an alternative to heavy water intensive agriculture, but being on the board of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency as stakeholders in the community itself and working to try and develop a more local food system. Now, part of this knowledge, and this goes way back, is the fact that there is a long history of dry farming grapes in California. We got to know Benito Ducey way back at the beginning of our farming in Paso Robles. His family planted their first vineyards in the early 1920s. Those vineyards are over 100 years old today. And a lot of what we were able to adapt to our location was thanks to his mentorship. And this is going to be something in the perennial crops, especially those that have a history are our teachers, and the people and the families who've worked those systems since the beginning are our teachers. And the participatory approach you're using, Yvonne, definitely starts with that sector of the wine grape growing community. And there are some new programs just starting up now in California to really understand how the dry farming of grapes varies from place to place, variety, person to person, historically, culturally, all of it together. And, the Zinfandel, Shiraz, and Pedro Jimenez, 3 grapes that are hot climate grapes at the same time, again, adapted very well to the kind of system we work with. We are proud of our product. It's, boy, if you like fruit forward wines, just as you like really juicy tomatoes, the kind of product that we're able to grow is an example of that kind of product. And I'll just close with a little Kuyama sunset, and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thanks so much, Steve. And as Steve alluded to, CAF is working with the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance and on a larger dry farming of wine grapes project. So if you are currently farming wine grapes, dry farming wine grapes in California, please do reach out to myself or my colleague Dave Runston. And if you are interested in transitioning or in planting, please reach out to us as well. And we'll get you connected to the right folks who are working on that. So now we have about 15 minutes left for any questions. It looks like there's been a bit of conversation in the Q&A section about some of the specifics for cover crop incorporation and the inoculant that was used. While I'm letting folks have an opportunity to type questions in, I guess one question I'll throw to the panel is, if you are someone who's considering planting or transitioning, what sort of advice do you have in terms of considering the specific, like how much rain do I need?
I can go ahead and start with that. I think that what you need is very dependent upon a lot of different factors, and what you choose to do is dependent on a lot of factors. And as I mentioned, for our farm, we're in a coastal, pretty relatively wet climate on the coast. We have a good amount of water, so that's not a concern for us. So for us, the selection for dry farming is frankly easier in some respects than like what than what like Steve's doing, for example, in a much drier climate where you're really kind of at the whims of drought years and things like that, for example, because we have the ability to to irrigate early on to get our plants established. So I would say for folks who are getting into it, I think what I'd recommend is recognizing that there's not like a one size fits all approach to this, nor is there like a single reason to do so. I think the reasons to doing it range from you have no access to irrigation water, so you have to, all the way to like us, which is more you want to have a differentiated product that's a lot tastier, in the case of tomatoes and so on. And so what I would also say is just each situation is very unique based on where you're located. So for our systems that I described earlier, it's very much based on what we have found has been effective over the last decade or so. And it probably would vary a lot, to another area. So I wouldn't say that anything that we've described or I described today is prescriptive. It's really more based on our own experience of testing out things over time. What I'd recommend to folks who are getting into it, though, is approach the process of getting into it with that same type of experimental approach. So have multiple sort of sets of things. If you're doing tomatoes, for example, plant in a couple different successions at different times of the year, a slightly different week windows, more or less. Plant some things where you're irrigating one a bit more, or making sure it has more access to irrigation versus the other one, and then maybe cut off irrigation at a different point. It's really a process of tinkering and kind of toying with it until you find a system that works for you. There's all types of other systems that we haven't described today. Flood irrigation is another mechanism that can be used for that first irrigation set that we've actually toyed with ourselves even for that first initial irrigation, which from our end had some positives, some negatives. So it didn't really make as much sense for us, but it's one of the examples of it's really about tinkering and toying with until you find something that works for your system. So I think you kind of approach it as you would a scientific research project of that nature, and kind of go from there. It is not something that I would say dive head first into it. If you're a brand new farm business that's starting off your business for the first year, commit to doing everything dry farm tomatoes. What I would say, though, is it's a system that you should start tinkering with today, and start toying with and seeing if it works for you, and if you can make the system work. And within a couple of years, you'll have a really good system, hopefully. Yeah, it's a couple is generous, maybe more than that, but yeah.
Yeah, I can also just add there that I think in conversations with farmers that there are a couple different things that come up that all are very interdependent and related. So there's rainfall, there's soil type, having enough clay in your soil to actually hold on to moisture. There's temperature in the summer. So, you might be able to handle higher temperatures if you have a higher clay content, or if there's more rain, so all of these things interact in really complicated ways, and will really change. Obviously, we know about microclimates in California as well. So I think it's hard to give like, this is exactly what you like, the limit, and anything above it, you're fine. But things to consider are sort of anything that might affect plant water use, and then also anything that might affect soil water holding capacity.
Yeah, to me, it's just, working a system that holds the water in the soil that the nature gives us in the wintertime. And one thing about a perennial crop, for me personally, I'm a firm believer in the fact that you need to start your perennials in a dry farm system. To take a conventional system that's close spaced, that's shallow rooted, that's dependent upon frequent irrigation, and convince it to become dry farm, I don't think so. I really don't. And then there was a question in the chat about, and it's a question that's come up now as we're starting to survey dry farm wine grape operations about, can we do no-till dry farming with grapes? And I think it's kind of like what Cole is saying, in an area with a lot of moisture, And especially with a water table that's up close to where the grapes can actually tap into it, it may be possible to no-till dry farm. But in a case like ours, where our water table is quite deep and our amount of rainfall is so low, we actually, if we don't stop evaporative loss in the summertime, we can't dry farm. So we're really dependent upon the dust mulch system, the old traditional Southern European, Northern African kind of system that's practiced in so many places even today.
And we have a follow-up question. Steve, are you using St. George?
Yes, we are. And I recommend either that or some of the varieties that were available 25 years when we planted that were sort of being came off of St. George was a little bit more disease resistant, but still vigorous, deep growing, fast developing root systems that get out of that upper dry layer down into the layers below where the moisture is.
Great. We've got someone else writing in the San Joaquin Valley, would dry farming be easier to be tried out in a perennial or an annual system?
That's a good question. I guess I think either one would work depending upon your soil type and the kind of crop you're working with. I know there are successful dry farm annual crops and very successful dry farm perennial crops in the San Joaquin Valley. But again, it's dependent on all those interwoven, interconnected factors that all three of us have been talking about.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think going back to what I mentioned earlier, it's not so much, you know, like in terms of saying it's particularly in a particular region like San Joaquin Valley or anywhere. It's not solely just the climate that's in that location. That obviously is a large factor into it, but it's also the particular land that you're on, the soil type that you're on. As Yvonne mentioned, you know, soil that's more clay based really helps. We have a clay loam soil that makes a big difference for us. I think dry farming is a lot more challenging from my experience, my perspective, in sandier soils. And on top of that, you know, the amount of work that you've gotten into building up that soil, building up organic matter, building up the water holding capacity of the soil makes a big difference too. So I would say it's not really so much that you can or can't do anything in any particular location or any particular climate. It's really a wider range of factors that's often very specific to the history of the land that you're on. And I think that's one of the challenges that, you know, we talk about things like organic, no-till, regenerative organic, and so on. It's not like, you know, you can just like flip a switch and say, hey, I'm no-till, or I flip a switch and say, hey, like, hey, I can dry farm. It's really a longer process to get to that point, and a lot of work to get to that point. And so I would just say, you know, whatever it is that you're doing, it's possible to do it. It just has to be kind of within a longer reach, you know, a longer framework of how to get there.
And one other thing that I'll add to that, I think, and curious what the other panelists think, in my sort of anecdotal experience, I think I've seen perennial crops being dry farmed in a little bit more extreme conditions than annual crops. And I think that makes a little bit of sense to me, just with even deeper rooting systems, they can access more water. And then also I think it can be a little bit more forgiving. You know, if you have a really tough year, if you're sort of out on the margins, with a perennial crop, you might not get a great harvest, but the plants might be able to survive a really dry year. Whereas with an annual, that's just like game over. Your crop just died. So I think depending on, again, exactly what the climate conditions are. If you're in a place that, I could imagine a place that's a little bit too hot in the summer to really think about fully dry farming an annual crop, but where I could potentially imagine a perennial one might work.
Yeah, it's sort of too, in our case, you know, a sandier loam soils actually works better for us because we get more, you know, percolation, infiltration of the water, and it moves quickly down in and fills all the capillaries. Whereas some of the clay soils in our area, the water hits and runs rather than so you know, there's a little bit of a balance. So we're working.
Yeah. And actually, I could speak to that a little bit too. Just as I mentioned, we're more of a clay loam for soil that we have not had as much of a history of kind of building up the soil over time. What Steve just described in terms of you know, water hits it and runs is kind of what you see. It's usually from our end that more soil that we worked for a longer period of time, we really improved the organic matter. That's where you have enough percolation, and the tilth is sort of better accordingly. But it speaks again to setting some of the complexities of like the particular land history of the site that you're on.
Great. We've got two more questions for these last sort of 4 minutes. Someone's asking, what about dry farming in urban areas like Santa Ana?
Well, I guess I would speak to what I saw us do at the farm at UCSC in Santa Cruz, where we worked with a couple different kinds of crops in very small locations that could be similar to an urban sized system, and as long as the factors that we've been talking about here during this session are applied, it can work. And the advantage you'll oftentimes have at least in an urban system, as far as I'm concerned, is you have other options for your mulch cover that holds in moisture. Organic matter of many different kinds, not necessarily just having to rely on soil cultivation. Like we're in a place where, number one, it's hard to grow the stuff that would become our mulch, and there's no source of any kind of commercial mulch that we could use within miles. So yeah, we're restricted to using the soil mulch, but an urban system sure opens up other possibilities.
Yeah, I think one other thing to consider there is that in my experience, dry farming is not the most space efficient use of farmland because you have to have this wide spacing. So I normally think of urban farms as wanting to pack as much as you can into a pretty small urban plot. And having said that, though, I will also say that in the study that we ran, there actually wasn't a correlation between plant spacing and like per acre yields. So, you can put plants in closer together and potentially still have that work. But I guess all of that to say, like, you likely will have lower yields. You might need to experiment with spreading those plants out a little bit more than you might want to ideally. But then again, if you don't have any water and this is the only way you can farm in an urban space, maybe better to grow something than nothing at all.
Yeah. I think I would more or less echo the same thing. I don't really have experience in urban farming, so I'm probably not the one to answer this question. But I would say again, it speaks to probably in year one or year two, most likely no. But if you have a location that you can build up, over time, it may be possible. But I think to echo what Yvonne said, it's definitely not most space efficient use of ag land. And so if that is a limiting factor, it may not make as much sense.
And I'm realizing I neglected to note the second part of that, which was Stevie Rock. For our final question, Cole, do you have presence of russet mites? And if so, how are you dealing with that?
We don't have a particularly big issue. As I mentioned, I think earlier, our largest issue that we've really had to contend with has been surveillance. Which are challenging in our area because surveillance tend to thrive in areas that have high organic matter, which is a good thing. To have high organic matter, generally speaking, it's kind of what you aim for, but in turn, that is kind of a significant pest accordingly. So from our perspective, it's been our general perspective on pest management, disease management is usually focused on building very healthy soil through a history of soil practices that we use. In turn, making sure the plants are healthy. Maybe spreading things out a little more, as I mentioned earlier, than some other farms do. Dry farm tomatoes are one of the crops that we do, but some of the things that we spread out to accordingly. And then from there, if there's issues that arrive, deal with them specifically. But this hasn't been a particularly significant pest for us. Some phyllins, I definitely for us has been number one. But again, that's very unique to our area in terms of having that be the number one issue for tomatoes. And so our systems has been more. Has been more tailored to kind of that for us.
Great. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. We are at 2:30, so that's our session.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you so much. That was great. Have a
Good
good rest
stuff.
of your day.
Yeah.
We'll see the rest of the attendees in the rest of the workshops.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.